Well, I asked you that question because for a Jesus story tonight, I want to share a story with you that really resonates deeply with me. It's a story I come back to over and over again when I think about my life as a kingdom citizen, as being part of Jesus' work here on earth. And we've been doing stories and talking about Jesus as a king from heaven who came to earth and brought the kingdom of God, the work of God, in a new and expanded way here on earth. And I love this story because it illustrates something that has deeply impacted me in how I see the world and how I see my responsibility as a kingdom citizen. And this particular story includes a moment when Jesus invites himself to dinner. And in this story, Jesus doesn't just invite himself to dinner, he actually invites himself to come and stay. And Jesus probably had his disciples, we know he had his disciples with him, so that's like at least 12 people. And he may have also had women and others who traveled with him. And so this could have been like a major invite of 20-some people to come and not just have dinner, but maybe even spend the night. This story comes to us in Luke chapter 19. And Dr. Luke, who was a physician, he wasn't an eyewitness of Jesus. He did research to get all of these stories that he put into a biography of Jesus that we call Luke. And I have to kind of assume that he probably interviewed kind of one of the main characters in this particular story. And the story goes like this. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. This is a big city that's on the way to Jerusalem. And if you were going to Jerusalem from the east, you had to go through Jericho. And so it's kind of like this funnel. And that actually becomes kind of relevant because of what Dr. Luke tells us next. He says, Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there, and he was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. So the tax collectors back in Jesus' day were the people who worked with the Romans, and they got a contract from the Romans to collect taxes from the Jewish people. And the tax collectors were Jewish people who committed to getting taxes from the Jewish people on behalf of the Romans, which felt like a compromise and a betrayal to start with. But the tax collectors were also allowed to collect more taxes than they owed to Rome, and so then they would become wealthy. Not only that, we find out that this particular person is a chief tax collector in Jericho. Jericho is like this funnel. Remember, everything has to go through Jericho to get to Jerusalem. And so, it is ripe with being able to, get taxes from people. And any goods that are going up to Jerusalem, all the rest, is happening by going through Jericho. So this particular person is the chief tax collector. So he's got tax collectors working for him, and he's taking some of their money. And they're taking money from the people, ripping them off in order to become wealthy people. So this particular person we meet in the story was a man, and he was a chief tax collector, and he was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but being a short man, he could not because of the crowd. Now, if you've been in and around church, you kind of already know where we're going with this story, because this is a character that we often tell our children about from Jesus, because he was a wee little man. If some of you grew up around church, there was a song around that. Yes. So he wanted to see Jesus and to be able to see who Jesus was, but being a short man, he could not because of the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see Jesus, since Jesus was coming that way. So you get this picture. This is a very wealthy man, very well dressed, and he hikes up his robes and he runs down the road and he finds a tree and he climbs up into the tree. Can you get this mental picture? This is pretty not something you would typically expect a wealthy person or a man to do in first century Palestine. But he is so excited to see Jesus and meet Jesus that he hikes up his robe, he runs ahead, he climbs a fig tree or a sycamore tree. They were trees that had short trunks, maybe 4 or 5 foot trunks, and then branches that went out, and you could sit on those branches quite easily. But he was up enough that he could see. The story goes on, when Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." There's your Jesus inviting himself over, not just for dinner, but I'm going to stay at your house tonight. Now, this is the first time that we hear the word Zacchaeus in this story, and we hear it from the mouths of Jesus. And we don't know, how does Jesus know who Zacchaeus is, but somehow he knows Zacchaeus. And maybe it's part of his divine nature because he's Jesus, or maybe he knows about Zacchaeus because he's the chief tax collector, and Jesus has come through Jericho before, and he's probably had to pay taxes as he's come through Jericho before, and he probably knows Zacchaeus' reputation possibly and how he likes to rip everybody off, and he's the chief collector, tax collector. So he says, Zacchaeus, and Jesus stops, and he looks up, and he says his name. There's something powerful about that Jesus stops, and he sees, and he says his name. And then he says, I'm coming to your house for dinner, and I'm going to spend the night. He invites himself over, and Zacchaeus is meeting him for the first time. So it says Zacchaeus came down at once and welcomed Jesus gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, he has gone to be the guest of a sinner. The Jewish people viewed the tax collectors as being unredeemable in a sense. They were beyond hope because they were given into working with the Romans, and then they were also corrupt, and they were ripping people off, and they were outsiders, and they were sinners. But Jesus goes to this man's house for dinner and to spend the night. But then it says, but Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord. So this is probably after a dinner, so kind of like right now, they've had dinner together, and he's heard the muttering of people saying, well, how can Jesus go and eat with that guy? And then he stands up at the end of the meal, and Zacchaeus says this, look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I cheated anyone out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount. I want to take this kind of in reverse order, like paying back 4 times. For the Jewish people, there were laws that told them that if they had ripped people off or whatever, that they had to pay them back plus 20%. But Zacchaeus says to Jesus, because Jesus has come to his house and he's accepted Jesus' invitation to come over, and in the presence of Jesus, he feels convicted. And in that conviction, he becomes aware of how he has been ripping people off. And not only does he feel convicted about it, he decides, says, Jesus, I'm going to do something about this. Because he's met Jesus. And he says, I'm going to pay back 4 times, 400% compared to what he'd ripped off. Yeah. And he's chief tax collector, right? So he's ripped off people consistently and constantly for who knows how long. And this is a major financial commitment. And what I am struck by about that part of the story is that when we meet Jesus, when the King of Heaven comes to our home, and we accept his invitation to come to our home, it's a wonderful thing because Jesus stops and Jesus sees us and Jesus speaks our name and says, I'm coming, I want to come to your home, and we invite Jesus into our home, into our life gladly. But in the presence of Jesus, there's conviction, isn't there? And when heaven's King comes to our home, we suddenly become aware that we have things that we've done wrong, and we want to take responsibility for them. A number of years ago, I was in the market for a new bike. If anybody knows me, I'm an avid biker. I had had one bike for about 10 years, and when I bought that bike, it was 10 years old. And so I'd had it for 10 years, and when I bought it, it had been rebuilt and was all new parts and everything, but now 10 years later it was getting worn down, and I had replaced some parts and whatever, but it was like needing new repairs. And of course, it's a 20-year-old bike, so there are new and improved bikes out there, right? So there are bikes that have 29-inch rims, which doesn't mean anything to you, but it's really important to me. And mine was 26-inch rims, and there were different kinds of gears and all this. So anyway, so I was in the market for a new bike. I found this new bike, amazing bike. I bought the bike. I put my old bike on Facebook, what do you call that thing? Marketplace, thank you. And for like $200 because it was worn. I put in there, it needs to be rebuilt and da-da-da-da. And so I had a couple different people come and look at it. One guy bought it for $200, and of course we had messaged, Facebook message back and forth. And about a week later, I got this Facebook message from this guy going, "You completely ripped me off." I'm like, "How did I rip you off? I told you this is a worn, used bike, it's only." But it turns out, and he sent me a picture, there was a crack in the frame, which I didn't know about, which basically makes it now kind of almost worthless. But I didn't know about this or whatever, and he was just livid. You knew this was there, and you were ripping me off, and blah, 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 blah. So finally I just said, well, I'll take it back. I'll give you your money back. So he comes to my house, and I meet him out in the driveway, and he hauls his bike out of his truck, and he plops it on the ground, and he literally like pushed it towards me. Like it was like I'm grabbing the bike, and then I gave him his money, and he took it, and then he left. And I thought, oh, he just really thinks I ripped him off. And then I read this story this week, and I thought, man, imagine if I would have like at least done 20% on top, given him what would that be, $240? Yeah, back, maybe he would have seen me different. Of course, I never thought about 400%, just so you know. Like, that would be ridiculous. $800 for a 200, no, but this feeling responsible, like I just felt his, ire towards me, his anger towards me, and I just felt responsible, right? And I was like, I want to try to make this right. I didn't probably succeed too well in doing it, but there's something about when we're in Jesus' presence, right? And when Heaven's King comes to our home, where suddenly around Jesus, we take responsibility for things that we've done wrong, and we want to make them right. And here's Zacchaeus trying to do that, because he's ripped people off. But Zacchaeus does a second thing, which I think is fascinating as we kind of go into this season with Thanksgiving and stuff too, is did you notice that it also says that he gave half of his possessions to the poor? That's a fascinating thing, isn't it? Out of everything that he owns, everything that he possesses, he's going to take half of it and give it to the poor. And one of the reasons I love this story is because it was so convicting to me when the first time I was sitting with this story and realized here is a man who takes responsibility for his wrongdoings, but he's also taking responsibility for our wrongdoings. Because there is this system in the world in which people become rich and some people become poor. There is a systematic way in which our world works, in which people like Zacchaeus can become wealthy, and they can become, those people have this amazing amount of wealth, but then there are other people who don't have opportunities, they don't maybe have education, they don't have whatever, and he is saying, I'm going to take half of this stuff that I've gotten, which he probably worked hard for that and whatever, but he recognizes that there are poor people in the world who haven't had that same kind of opportunity. And I see Zacchaeus in this story having met Heaven's King and in the presence of Heaven's King feeling responsible for his own wrongdoings, but also feeling his responsibility in a system that is broken and is wrong, isn't working the way it's supposed to work. And he could have just given back the 4 times for ripping people off and taken personal responsibility for his stuff, but he also is willing to say, there's something wrong with the world, where there are wealthy people like me, and there are people who don't have opportunity to make their own way through the world. And he decides to give half of his possessions to the poor. Well, at the end of this story, it ends this way, because Jesus, having seen Zacchaeus' commitment to give half of his possessions to the poor, and to anyone that he's cheated to pay them back 4 times, Jesus says to him, to Zacchaeus, today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save what was lost. Of course, that applies to Zacchaeus personally, that he is now in the presence of Jesus, one who wants to be a citizen of Jesus' kingdom. And as a citizen of Jesus' kingdom, he takes responsibility for his personal things, as well as taking responsibility for a kingdom of this world that isn't working the right way and wanting to see it changed by giving his possessions away. But I think it's fascinating that Jesus says salvation has come to this home, because Jesus has come to seek and save what was lost. And it doesn't say who was lost, it says what was lost. And that strikes me because there's a way in which Jesus' whole mission on earth was obviously to reach us personally, but it also was to bring a kingdom that would seek and save what was lost from the beginning. Because in the beginning, God created the world to be just and equal and full of opportunities for everyone. And Jesus came to seek and save and to bring back what was lost. And for some reason, Zacchaeus feels that responsibility as a citizen of the kingdom. And that's really impacted me and has begun to really shape my way of thinking about the world and what I'm doing. And I think about this even with our Thanksgiving kinds of things coming up, and like, what am I doing with my possessions? Do I recognize that there is a world in which I need to take responsibility for my own stuff, but also am I part of a world or part of a kingdom that wants to seek and save what was lost, and to reverse the effects of the fall, and to reverse the curse that's on this world, and to bring about justice, and to bring back equality in this world. And I see Zacchaeus committing to that and reacting to that in this particular story. Well, that's my kind of little take on Zacchaeus, and I'm curious what kind of strikes you and stands out for you. So we're going to turn you back to your tables for a little time and just invite you to share, was there anything that stood out for you from hearing this story about Zacchaeus, or anything that I have to share, and give you some time to process that at your tables. And you're always free, of course, to pass if you would rather not.